to something like landscape history. And that's, I think, why it's relevant today. It's not to say that like what happened in 800 BC could happen today or like is the same as I mean, that would be silly to compare neoliberal capitalism to the past. But we do get really cool insights just into how humans relate to the world around them and how it can be very political and uneven, and how landscape changes can even impact, social changes and can create wealth differences like we're seeing today, right? Like,
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back today with somebody who I'm excited to talk with because we're going to be talking about old-timey stuff. The Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the caveman days, back when people would say stuff like ooga booga and make things with their hands. We've got Katie Kearns, aka Catherine Kearns. She is assistant professor of classics down at the University of Chicago. How's that?
That's right. That's right.
Not too shabby. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just start off by asking you, how did you get interested in old stuff?
Yeah, I was lucky. So I went to a public school outside Philly, and I had a couple teachers who got really into history and teaching it through objects. And it just sounded like a really cool job. So it was a way to travel, learn about history, and work with your hands and touch things. And I went to George Washington University for my undergraduate degree, which actually had a major in archaeology. So suddenly I was taking all these classes, North American, the archaeology of what is now like Mexico, Guatemala, the Mediterranean. And I just thought it was really cool. And then you got to go in the summer and dig a hole and find stuff that hadn't been seen in millennia. And then I found out that there are no jobs in archaeology once I was already a grad student. But by then I was really into it. I really liked it. I liked the questions that you could ask through archaeology. So basically the study of people through the things that we use and that we make and that we relate to. Yeah.
Do you get have you ever made any discoveries yourself where you pull something out of the ground and you have this moment where you think, oh my God, look at this. This has got a story behind it.
Yeah, sometimes. So not too many cases like that. I mostly excavate houses, or I'm trying to find the everyday people. But a couple, one time we actually came down on a human body where we weren't expecting one. So that can sort of pause the whole operation. What is happening? What do we do? I found cool ceramics where I didn't know what it was, but the director runs over and is like, oh my God, that's so cool. We found something like this before and now we can put it together. But no, I've never found anything super sexy, like a inscription or a statue or gold or,
It's the Holy Grail.
Sadly, no. Yeah.
So as far as do you have to get funded? I mean, obviously it takes a lot of manpower to go out there with brushes and brush off, old skulls and stuff. Is there a funding thing? Do you have to get funding from somewhere and then they prioritize that and say, okay, we'll give you some money. Now go out and see if you can find something?
Yeah, so there are different options for funding, but yes, you do need money. And it depends on the scale of your project, how many people are you bringing, are you living on site, and therefore you have to feed people and make sure they have running water. Are you renting cars to drive out to the site and back? So some projects can actually be quite expensive compared to others, and there are different funding options. So if you are an academic and you're based at a university, maybe they have some funding. Then there are national or federal or state organizations that can give you funding, and then also private individuals or other kinds of academic organizations or institutions. So the big one in the US is the Archaeological Institute of America. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. And so as far as funding, what's their favorite thing to fund as far as the people that are funding it? Do they have like a preference, or like, we really want to excavate this particular place?
Yeah, that's interesting because that's changed over time. So archaeology began as a discipline, as like an academic discipline in the 19th century. And it was very much based on Greek and Roman artifacts, particularly those that were very pretty, like vases or sculptures or bronzes. So they were going after things like tombs, because you tend to find whole vessels or full objects in tombs. And then for a long time, we were really focused on cities. So like the site of the palace, for example. So a lot of funding went into cities like Athens or Corinth in the Greek world, or Rome, obviously, or Pompeii. And now I would say that it depends on the research question. So some organizations want to fund these similar, like, kind of big urban sites, and others are more experimental. So you're going out and you're kind of getting a sense of a landscape that hasn't actually been surveyed or studied yet. And so there's funding for that as well. So kind of a more exploratory reconnaissance style of archaeology.
And at some point they sent you to Armenia. Is that right?
That they sent me. So
somebody.
I had a really cool professor as a grad student, and I was just like, you are so smart. I want to go where you go. And I was lucky I got to go for 2 seasons to work with her and her project, which was a Persian period. So the Achaemenid Persian Empire. So like roughly 5th century BCE.
Wow.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that you discovered in Armenia, and what did you think about the people and the modern day culture and the food and stuff like that?
Oh, it was great. So we worked with local workmen. So I was running a trench with maybe 7 or 8 Armenian men who were helping me excavate. And I got to learn a lot of like really basic conversational Armenian, but mostly things like, pull the string or sweep, or like these very task-based things. It was a really wonderful project. So we were excavating a room at this settlement. So like stone walls, a paved floor, finding lots of evidence of domestic context. So like the ways people were cooking food, or some of the things they might have traded and exchanged for. So like ceramics that look like they came from a different area, imports and that kind of thing. And we lived in a village and ate Armenian food. And I have to say it was good, although it's not, it doesn't have a lot of the spices. So it's mostly like salt, pepper, those kinds of things, but really good vegetables and grilled meats.
That sounds delicious.
It was really good. Yeah.
So what are some of the things that you can gather from an excavation or from archaeology? What are some like conclusions you can draw about the way people lived, and what are some things that you just can't know?
So there's so much that you can't know. And that is because of just the rhythms of deposition. So normally, let's say the site I work at on Cyprus, it's probably a small rural building. The rates of deposition that happened after the site was abandoned mean that it's really hard to get to like a particular moment in time. So it's hard to get to like the level of human experience of like what it was like, doing a particular task. What we really have are the residues and the traces of it. And so we can kind of reconstruct what some of the tasks might have been, like grinding or a kiln, so like making pottery or some other craft work. We can try to reconstruct things like what they might have been eating, or what animals they might have been engaging with in terms of like meat production or dairy production, or more social relationships with animals. So we can start to kind of reconstruct patterns of practices, but it gets very hard to pinpoint down to like a particular human's experience. And that's because what we're finding are in many ways things that people just left behind. They're not like intentionally left for us to like recreate a story. And so it can be hard to pick apart what leads to a particular deposition of things. So, and this is why context really matters. So we're really careful of like, where did we find things in relation to one another? Can we tell how things might have been grouped together as a kind of practice? But there are a lot of things about, the human mentality that archaeology just can't really get at.
Why don't we just watch the videos from those days?
I always tell my students, it'd be really cool if we could just interview people, right? If we had access to like human subjects to interview, but we don't. We really are working with this idea that through objects we can learn more about the human condition. So the way that we use mugs and why I have a particular mug and you have a different mug and what that might say about patterns of exchange or production or consumption or identity. Like these are all really cool questions because humans interact with things all the time. We make things, we destroy things, we choose things, and we ignore other things. And those choices and those patterns are really interesting to think about in terms of, like historical processes.
And they help you to draw the conclusions where we can make safe assumptions about what it was like.
Yeah. So, I would say we can provide more or less convincing explanations for something. But you're always going to be sort of dependent on the remains that you have. And as we were just discussing, archaeology can be an expensive practice. And so you're only excavating a tiny part of a site or a tiny lens into a particular group or community or household's practices. And so then you have to really like extrapolate out from that or project out from that. And it's, are your explanations of that convincing based on what you have?
Are there bureaucratic problems that you have to go through, especially when you're excavating in a foreign country and maybe they have rules or laws against special, burial places or stuff like this?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of in all stages of archaeological knowledge production, you have political institutions. So, for example, getting a permit even to work in another country. And these can look different depending on the country. And then there's on the other side, like, what do you do with all the stuff that you find? So each country has different laws, like legal frameworks and institutions for what happens to that cultural heritage. What happens to the site? What happens to the materials? Do you leave it there? Are you allowed to export any of it for analysis? And a lot of these laws were created in response to European empires in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries and early 20th centuries, just taking things, right? So, the very famous case of the Elgin marbles at the British Museum, but there are myriad other examples of colonial practices that took things. And we are now in an era where there are a lot of legal frameworks in place to understand where objects should be, and particularly for new excavations, like when you find things now, like in summer 2023, what do you do with the stuff that you find?
Yeah. What happens in Pompeii stays in Pompeii.
Yeah. And I mean, some countries were really forward thinking about this. So Cyprus, for example, where I work, under the Ottoman Empire was already creating antiquities laws and measures to sort of take stock of what was on the island. And throughout the 20th century, it manipulated and tweaked those legal frameworks. So these are, evolving practices to kind of take stock of cultural heritage based on a country's or a nation's understandings of its own heritage. Yeah.
That's good. And did you also go to Pompeii?
I have been to Pompeii, and I, as a grad student one summer, I got to excavate at one of the villas around the Bay of Naples. So not Pompeii itself, but like looking at Vesuvius, the Villa Ariana. Yeah.
I love Naples. I really loved it there.
I love it too. It's a really great city.
What'd you think about the people and the pizza?
Love it. Yeah. So I studied abroad in Rome as an undergraduate, and I just so happened that one of my roommates was Neapolitan. So we spent a lot of time taking the train down there, and I just loved it. I loved to be honest with you, it reminded me of Philly. It's like, it's like a gritty, like the people are so vibrant and like they've got attitude and the food is really good. Yeah.
Yeah. I found that to be so true. I would walk the streets and there was just dog poop and garbage, but the people were so nice and the food was so good. I said, this is the best place I've ever been in my whole life.
Yeah. The food was really, really good.
Yeah. Well, we love to talk about places like that, travel like that, and absorbing that culture like that. You actually have written a few books, right? Can you brief? I know you're a bit bashful about it, but it's kind of impressive that you've written these books. Can you explain the books that you've written and like roughly what they're about? Yeah.
So I helped organize a conference when I was a grad student on Cypriot archaeology. So that's one book. It's an edited volume. And we were really proud about that because it featured Cypriot archaeologists and particularly the kind of younger class of archaeologists. So the conference was around 2014 and it was like early career researchers and scholars. So people who were just sort of starting their own projects or working with data. And it's cool because they were all doing really interesting techniques or methodological approaches to some of the Cypriot archaeological sites and landscapes and artifacts. So things like radiocarbon dating or compositional analysis. So this is when you look at ceramics through either microscopes or you're doing isotopic analyses or basically compositional analysis to understand the fabric, the actual soils and clays that went into making the pot. And then you can think about regional differences. This was one really cool method that a colleague was doing around the time. And that book, it sort of takes the pulse of Cypriot archaeology in the Bronze and Iron Ages right around like 2015. And then I have just published my first sort of monograph, like my own book, just a couple months ago. And that one is a landscape archaeology of Archaic Cyprus. This is the period of roughly the 9th to the 5th centuries BCE. And it tries to understand a period of real social and political transformation. So this is when we start to see these historical kingdoms, which are centered around a town. And then they have these kind of dispersed or, landscapes around them. And I was really interested in understanding the countrysides, the rural landscapes around the town through the lens of environmental history. So how people in the countryside are interacting with climate change, how they are settling, where they're choosing to settle, how they're relating to the town. So the book kind of does a bunch of things. It's a book about how archaeologists talk about climate and environmental history. It's also a book about how we talk about ruralism as opposed to urbanism or in relation to urbanism. And then it's also a book about this really cool period on Cyprus, the Archaic period, where there's just a lot of stuff happening, trade with the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, new forms of political authority, new signs of wealth, in particularly in burials. So yeah, the book is trying to ask a lot of different questions through those sorts of lenses. Yeah. And so
during that time in the climate and environmental concerns, were there issues in those days or anomalies that happened that affected these things?
Yeah, so this was something I was really interested in as a grad student, and this book develops out of my dissertation. We, as a field, archaeology, are getting better at reconstructing ancient environments. And this is partly due to increased interest in paleoclimates, so the climates of millennia ago, partly driven by actually modern, climate modeling. So like to understand future projections of climate, we also want to understand past models or, evidence that we have for changing climate, particularly precipitation and temperature. And so there is this period, or there's increasing evidence through a lot of paleoclimatic approaches. And many of these come with a whole truckload of caveats about resolution, how you think about them as proxies, how far you can extend the data. But there is enough of a consensus now that it looks like the second millennium, so the late second millennium, so this is the late Bronze Age in the Mediterranean. So we're talking like roughly 1200 BCE.
Okay.
Roughly a kind of regional pattern across the Eastern Mediterranean is of aridity, or an increase in aridification. So things are getting drier. Now, it doesn't happen everywhere at the same time, and it happens at kind of different rhythms, but we now have natural archives in the form of things like sediment cores, speleothem cores, charcoal and wood analysis that's showing that in places like Cyprus, in places like the Peloponnese of Greece, southern Turkey, Jordan, the Levant, things were getting drier. And then around the 8th century, again, the timing is hard to nail down, but around the 8th century, in many of these places, it appears that things kind of get wetter. So we're talking about very coarse patterns of things like precipitation, mostly. And then the question for archaeologists is, how do you relate that to the archaeological patterns that we see on the ground? So things like settlements, where people are living, how quickly they're abandoning their sites, or are they choosing to stay in places longer? And for a long time, this transition between the late Bronze Age and what's called the Iron Age by the 8th century was really marked by a kind of collapse of interregional institutions. So if you've heard of the late Bronze Age collapse, this is a lot of these late Bronze Age kingdoms, centralized institutions are abandoned or show signs of serious breakdown. And then there tend to be disruptions in settlement patterns in places like the Peloponnese, the Aegean, Cyprus. And so my book was trying to wrestle with this. Like, what does it mean that we start to see settlements again when potentially climatically things are getting wetter? And so the book tries to put forward a lot of sort of critical ways of thinking about this, that it would be really simplistic to just say, well, sure, it started raining more. That's why there are kingdoms. I mean, that's a really reductive way to look at it. On the other hand, on a semi-arid island like Cyprus, where water is a critical environmental variable and where precipitation has a lot of impact on things like vegetation, soil erosion, something like wetter conditions are possibly creating new kinds of interactions with the landscape. And this is, particularly in the 8th and 7th centuries, this is a period where we see more permanent settlements, particularly in the area that I'm working in.
So it's amazing. Do you think, and to what's to account for these changes as far as, was it humans' effect or being there on the land and doing stuff like agriculture? Would that be the main driver?
So this is a great question, and it's something that has motivated archaeologists to look at environmental history and landscape change, because many of the sites that we're excavating or that we're interested in excavating, we want to understand how landscape change affected the site, was a reason for why the site is there, how people at the site interacted with the landscape, and then after the site may have been abandoned, how landscape change affected the sort of depositional processes around the site. In terms of, land use, absolutely. So we know that humans have been affecting or impacting the land around them for millennia. I mean, even hundreds of thousands of years, you could make arguments, particularly with fire, with the creation and the use of fire. So we are manipulating the environments around us. By the time you get to the 8th century, you're talking about agriculture, animal husbandry. We already have the beginning, or we have on Cyprus, for example, cities, so urbanization, so settlements interacting with the land around them. And so this is something that we're interested in, is understanding how humans shape the landscapes around them and how those landscapes in turn shape what we do and our sort of possibilities or our choices in things like land use or settlement or interaction even. Yeah.
That is so interesting. And it really echoes what everybody's talking about now, which is, oh, climate change. Well, why? What happened? It's like, it's always been a thing where our existence and how we live can have an effect. Who'd have thunk it?
Absolutely. And so one of the interesting and also very difficult things is scale, right? So how do we study the scale at which humans and the landscapes are in this kind of give and take of impacting one another? Some of it can be very local in scale. So you're affecting, something like vegetation cover, where you're cutting down trees to make room for agriculture. So that's having like an effect on a particular scale of environment. Now, of course, we're talking about humans as the kind of geophysical agents that are having the scalar impact of global planetary warming, right? So the scale at which certain humans or certain human groups or institutions have effects at these different scales. And it's all very political. So that's another thing that I'm interested in are some of these, social political dimensions of human environment relationships. Yeah.
And that's very interesting. And so when we talk about the Bronze Age, was this was before or after bigger organized kind of kingdoms like Rome and stuff like this? What's the timeline there?
Yeah, so it's always funny because I have colleagues who are in Near Eastern studies, and to them, the late Bronze Age is like recent because in Mesopotamia, right, you have urban civilizations 5 millennia ago, 6 millennia ago. So you have urban, like Ur or Uruk, these massive sort of like the emergence of urbanization. The late Bronze Age is like millennia after that. So around, the middle of the second millennium BCE. And that's particularly the regional term for the Mediterranean. So places like the Aegean, the Greek mainland, Western Turkey, places like Cyprus or the Levant, what is now Israel, Lebanon, those places. Then Rome is maybe the middle of the first millennium. So around, you could pick a date, 500 BCE. Rome it has its kings and it's sort of in Italy. And then for the next couple of centuries, it expands out through these territorial, militarized undertakings. And eventually by the end of the first millennium BCE, it is the empire that we know of Rome. Yeah.
An epic spread.
Some of these political forms have very long lives and others appear to us to be shorter. And so one really kind of interesting methodological problem for archaeologists is, what's the time frame of our analysis and how do we relate that to human time frame? So like you and I, like we think in terms of days, years, decades, maybe generations. But to an archaeologist, a period that lasts 500 years is kind of typical. That's actually like great. Like, wow, you have 500 years of data. So like, how do you start to piece that down to get closer to the kind of human experience is a difficult question.
So as far as, the Roman Empire maybe lasted 300 years or something. The American Empire is going to last probably 300 years. It's almost over. How long, what's one of the longest kind of dynasties or empires or just, points in history? Was it the nomadic times or?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I mean, my mind first went to Egypt. And that's a really interesting case because, and I'm not an Egyptologist, but even the Egyptians kind of committed to this narrative that they were a stable political form for something like 4 or 5, millennia. So from the time of the first pyramids down to the last pharaohs in the Ptolemaic period, they bought into and they projected this idea of stability. We know, and Egyptologists would be able to tell you even better than I could, that it wasn't that stable, right? There are disruptions, there's internal instabilities in certain periods, but they really were committed to this narrative of like, we have had this pharaonic institution and this is how it is. And it's divinely created and reproduced. But you mentioned something like nomadism, and that can have really long-term patterns in the landscape as well. So it depends on region. A lot of archaeological attention tends to go to the sort of state level of society, so something like Egypt. But there's really exciting work being done out there on more nomadic or mobile societies. How do we understand them archaeologically? Yeah.
What I'd like to call the good old days. back before we knew what horrible things lie in wait with technology and things like this. The nomadic people. I applaud them for their simplicity.
So some of the cool things we're learning actually is that nomadic societies could have a lot of complexity in terms of politics, intermarriage, so social relations. And it's partly actually a result of our own ancient sources that kind of call them simplistic, and that we have created these sort of assumptions about what that lifestyle would have looked like. But it's because we're reading, Herodotus, who calls them simplistic. That's what they were reading in the 19th century. And that's why there's been this bias for so long about like what we as archaeologists should study.
Simplistic shouldn't be a derogatory term. It can be a great, wonderful term. I mean, if somebody called me simple, that would be a lie, but I would love it. That would be so nice. But as far as that goes, have you studied a little bit at least of the nomadic kind of caveman days?
No, the earliest I've gone is like late Bronze Age, but okay. Pastoralism is a really interesting land use practice that we know is happening in the period that I study. And what we need more of really are the remains of animal bones to study that. So there are zooarchaeologists who specialize in the study of faunal remains, and they can tell you a lot from, single bones, from things like cut marks or evidence of cooking or the age or pathology of the animal itself. So was it an older goat? In which case we know that it's, for X reason, or young, like killing patterns, mortality patterns based on things like dairy production or meat production or wool production. So there's a lot that we could learn from animal bones. And of course, a big question then is how pastoralism was part of a region's political economy. So what we know is that a lot of Mediterranean antiquity was a form of mixed agriculture and pastoralism. So people are herding at the same time that they are cultivating plants. Yeah.
Interesting. So, and I have another stupid question because I'm full of them. As far as the agricultural revolution versus the Bronze Age, what's the timeline difference there?
So what we call the Neolithic revolution is the domestication of particularly plants and then animals. And this is not happening in the same place everywhere at the same time, but typically, particularly in places like Turkey, places like Syria, we consider that the beginning of the Neolithic period coming out of what's called the Younger Dryas, which is roughly 11,000. Like 10,000 BCE.
And why
into like 9,000? So like 10,000 years ago. Yeah.
And the term Bronze Age, roughly, what is that insinuating there?
That's a great question because it doesn't mean the same, again, a 19th century way of dividing time. This guy was just like bronze, copper, bronze, iron, stone. But the Bronze Age is meant to invoke the uptake of the technology of mining and smelting metals, particularly to create bronze, so copper, tin. So you're alloying those together. So before that, we had a Copper Age, where we know that people are mining and smelting copper, and they're producing all kinds of things. And then after the bronze, we know that iron becomes the kind of more ubiquitous metal and its uptake is more visible across places like the Mediterranean.
And why is that? Did one come before the other when they were always kind of there and in the ground?
So this is a really good question that many people are trying to answer. Some of these metals, like bronze, for example, take a kind of sophisticated technological process. So you're alloying different quantities of metals together to produce bronze. It's not as direct as something like copper, where you're taking it out of the ground. And I'm simplifying this, but iron is a really tough example because it doesn't just appear overnight across the Mediterranean. So we know that it's a byproduct, for example, of copper smelting. Like at the chemical mineralogical level, you can have these iron residues and then people start using them. And the propensities of iron just became more useful in this transition into the first millennium. So it's a harder metal. So we start to see it used more as tools, utilitarian kind of technology. So like your knife will now start to be made out of iron, or your agricultural implements. So things that you're using in a kind of like everyday form. We also have very elite luxury goods that are made out of iron. So this is why it's difficult, and there isn't like a single example of why iron takes off. But we do think that the propensities of it made it very useful in something like everyday life. And bronze is still made, right, after the Iron Age. So we know that metals hold different values for people. And so it's just interesting based on region how some of these practices differ from one another.
And obviously there's some minerals are found in certain regions more so than others.
Right. So Cyprus has copper in these pillow lavas that surround the central mountain area, the Troodos Mountains. And so we know that they are digging, mining, smelting copper really early and probably trading it off the island really early. So then an interesting question is how Cyprus becomes embedded in these interregional trading exchange networks, because people elsewhere really want the copper to make something like bronze or you know, for whatever reason. And this is where texts become really helpful, because by the late Bronze Age, we have texts like between two kings, like the king of Egypt sends a letter like, where is my copper? You told me you were going to send it. I gave you the money for it. Where is it? And they're like, you know, really cool windows into these economic exchanges, but also that have very political, social, cultural overtones. Like there's intermarriage married or warfare, or you can tell that a king is being really snarky to another king because he doesn't use the highest formal language. He calls him like, you know, king instead of brother or something like this. And so you get into these kind of really cool windows into particularly elite networks. Yeah.
The very first receipt for something was written on the stone tablet and between two kings.
My colleagues who study cuneiform could give you many more examples, because those go back, I mean, millennia in Mesopotamian history. Receipts, letters, lots of really cool documentary texts.
When you say cuneiform, this is like the first, written language? Is that
in Mesopotamia? Okay. Cuneiform, a kind of script. And here, I'm not an expert in Mesopotamian languages because we have many different regional languages over time. We have evidence of bilingual, exchanges where people are translating something into another language. You have different values of language. So you have like a royal language in some places and the more sort of documentary administrative language. This is the case, for example, in Egypt. So my colleagues in Near Eastern Studies could give you many more examples. But yeah, we have many, many cool cuneiform documentary texts.
That is so cool.
It's really, texts make everything better. I mean, when you have texts, it's really cool to be able to supplement your archaeological projects in that way of thinking when you have texts.
And the whole idea of the process that they did to, decrypt the ancient languages and stuff, I can't imagine how fun and interesting and, that's so cool. That's
Yeah, and there are still some that are undeciphered. So hey,
really,
if you want to get interested, there are languages for which we don't have enough to decipher. Yeah,
I'm going to university. That's it. That settles it. I know my purpose. So you spent you're obviously really highly focused on Cyprus.
Most recently, yeah.
What is it about Cyprus that has got you so? Because you can excavate anywhere in the world, but why Cyprus?
Yeah, again, 1 year in grad school, really smart guy invited me on his project to Cyprus, and that became my dissertation advisor. And he was doing a geophysics survey of 2 late Bronze Age cities. And so I was particularly drawn to the methods and to the project. And then I found this sort of research topic on Archaic Cyprus that had been maybe understudied. The data hadn't really been looked at in this particular region I was working. And so you start going back every summer. You start first year grad student, and then you get a job and you can bring your own students. It's a really wonderful place to work. And I think, research wise, it hits a lot of the things I'm interested in. So human environment interactions, landscape. So we had all this data that hadn't really been looked at that allowed me to ask some of these questions more easily than if I had to start over myself. And then, yeah, Cyprus is amazing. I mean, the people are really wonderful. The food is great. The combination of island with kind of a large island, which has a major mountain region in the center and along the northern coast, different regional patterns. So it's big enough that it's really interesting and complex. And I was drawn to the sort of Cypriotness of it, that it's not Greek, it's not Turkish, it's its own place with its own histories, people, and it's been a really great place to work. Yeah.
And from an academic standpoint, it's probably good that you can become an expert in one particular region rather than kind of going here and there, and then you become the person that knows that.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are different options, particularly in archaeological work. So some people specialize in a method. So something like, for example, zooarchaeology, which I was talking about. So like you focus in on the study of animal bones and human-animal relationships. And then you can actually go on a lot of projects, study the bones that they've found, and that opens up a lot of really cool collaboration and sort of like cross-regional comparison. And then depending on your training, some people also focus on regions. And if your degree is in classics, particularly like classical archaeology, you tend to focus on the Mediterranean, places in the Mediterranean, and you become kind of specialized in a particular place. Yeah. But there are different options. Some people are more comparative than others. Yeah.
Well, as soon as you get sick of the one place, then you say, well, I want to go over here and do something.
I don't know if it's that easy, but yeah, theoretically. I mean, right, like I don't speak Turkish. So like if I just showed up in Turkey one day, I don't think I would get a permit. But what's cool about archaeology is that it is an inherently collaborative discipline. So you work with other people and you can join other projects, or you can work together with multiple projects to, do something really cool, like combining different data sets. Do
you find the other archaeologists to be nice when you go to other places? Are they welcoming and most of the time?
Yeah, they're all game. No, they're all great. Yeah.
Yeah, I would think archaeologists. They're like a biker gang. You got to watch your back.
No, it's a really wonderful job because people are really, really great, very nice, very welcoming. And I've been lucky to work in a bunch of different places, and that has been true everywhere I've worked. And it's really cool when you can collaborate with people on these sort of multi data set projects, or come together for a paper or something, and you bring people from different projects together. Yeah.
That's cool. That sounds so. I'm jealous. I'm kind of jealous. I wish that I had your gig because it really sounds like a lot. I'll ask you one last question, and then we'll talk after this. But I'll cut this off. What's next for you? What's the next project that you're going to be working on? Where are you going? What are you looking for?
Yeah, everybody keeps asking me that, and I don't know, including for tenure. No, I'm probably interested in some of the same questions as my current book or the one that was just published. So, I'm really interested in questions like sustainability in the ancient world. So we talk about it. We talk about things like self-sufficiency. So what did it actually look like for a household to be self-sufficient in terms of, let's say, a mixed agro-pastoralist community where you're doing some herding, you're doing some cultivating, you're doing some other craft production. So concepts that are coming out of like environmental history, political ecology right now, like scarcity, marginality, risk management. I'd like to spend some time thinking about those more carefully and critically, and maybe including more data sets, as I was just saying. So maybe compare what's happening in the records we have from Cyprus to other places, maybe even other islands. So kind of keeping it in this, a study of something like environmental resource management, in a particular period, and what that looks like on a day, as close as we can get to something like everyday practice.
Do you have some inclination what ancient peoples had a good relationship to the environment and did have a sustainable, because I know some of them didn't, like Easter Island, people in Easter Island, they kind of shot themselves in the foot, but others, do you have any idea?
Yeah, so this is partly why I'm interested in this, because I think sometimes we make assumptions, and a lot of the assumption comes from cases where things went bad. So like deforestation, for example, it's a really like sexy way to think about, they couldn't handle their resources. But that seems to me like very simplistic. So what, can we find evidence to think about something like shifting attitudes to forests? But we know that some people lived in the same place for a really long time, like multiple generations of people. And political institutions might be changing, but these settlement patterns seem really persistent over, let's say, 3 or 4 centuries. And one kind of immediate takeaway from that is that they had some kind of sustainable land use practice where they are interacting with the environment around them, and it is able to kind of cross generations, that those households or those communities, that network is able to stay, let's say, in the same place doing moderately similar land use practices. So those are the kinds of places that I would want to just investigate more. Like, what does it look like on a household level? How much is coming in or out of something like a village network? What are their opportunities for trade? And these are some questions that are becoming much more present in Mediterranean archaeology, particularly over the last couple decades. Things like risk management or resiliency, which is a word I don't tend to like in the way that it's used in the past, but these are some of the things that people are getting more and more interested in. And a lot of that is because we look around the world around us, and we're we're partly anxious, and we're partly like, what does it mean? What did it look like in the past? What does it mean for us? Those kinds of questions. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no comparison to the modern last 200 years industrial revolution and the exploitative nature of how we do things now. I also am very interested to know whether or not the people who lived before, did they live sustainably because they were smart, or were they just lucky enough to have the right climate that just never changed? Because I know that at some point we had climate anomalies that actually wiped out people's crops and like created havoc. And
yeah, so these are the really interesting questions that the data is starting to get there to be able to at least answer or like point us in better directions. So one, for example, you mentioned drought. We can now kind of think, particularly through dendrochronology, in terms of like 2 to 3 years of really bad drought is going to cause a serious problem because you've gone through your reserves from your harvest. But something like saying that like the climate of 100 years was bad and therefore people abandoned their sites. I mean, that's where it gets a lot more macro scalar and it's harder to prove on the ground. One of the things I've learned in doing archaeology is just to give people in the past a lot of credit. And so I tend to not say that like they were lucky or things were favorable, because they're doing stuff, right? They're living there. They understand their surroundings. And this is one of the things I'm interested in is, how do farmers understand seasonal changes? How are they adapting to them? How are they mitigating certain risks? And they were smart, right? They're creating these really sophisticated water management systems or irrigation. And so I tend to work from the presumption that like they know what they're doing, they have technology. And this is maybe where politics comes in, like certain states impose particular taxation regimes or imperial, extraction measures ramp up or warfare, like those social and political dimensions are really critical to something like landscape history. And that's, I think, why it's relevant today. It's not to say that like what happened in 800 BC could happen today or like is the same as that would be silly to compare neoliberal capitalism to the past. But we do get really cool insights just into how humans relate to the world around them and how it can be very political and uneven, and how landscape changes can even impact, social changes and can create wealth differences like we're seeing today, right? Like certain people are very marginalized and are suffering more through global warming than other people. So like those are the sorts of things that we can see in the past as well.
Do you think some of the technological advances in agriculture were fairly innocuous back then? And obviously today the technological advances we have are very criticized because we're being seen as the agricultural, the tractors and the oil it takes to do. Do you think that the technological advances in agriculture back then were like relatively harmless, or were there also knock-on effects? Like you just mentioned, like income inequality or inequality in general from do you think technology always kind of inherently creates these inequalities?
No. And, this is one of the great things about archaeology of the globe. Because I think when you start looking at all of the rich examples of human environment relationships from places like North America, or the Amazon, for example, we have histories of more collective management of resources, sharing of technology, non-hierarchical political organizations. So we have examples where it's not always about somebody extracting something from the people below them, or, top down or state level, asymmetrical politics. So it's really cool. I mean, we do have examples of more, collective, collaborative, sort of horizontal landscape practices. Yeah.
That's my favorite kind of agricultural practices. Horizontal.
I mean, what's so cool is, so many of the cool mound sites in this country, in America, archaeologists are really starting to understand that these are more collective, monumental undertakings. So it's not like someone in power was directing all this labor. They were choosing to build these together. And there might have been differences in who was doing what work. And it's not like it was a world that existed without politics, but this is a kind of like collective monumentality, which is really cool to think about. Yeah. And I think working in the Mediterranean, we're so accustomed to states and empires and this sort of like hierarchical, asymmetrical way of doing things that the comparative look is really helpful.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate it. Well, you just nowadays in our foregone, capitalist kingdoms and empires and stuff, you say the word socialist and people start booing you. They go, boo. But in reality, human evolution has always been a collective effort. But yeah, well, we'll leave it there. And next time you're going to come back and we're going to talk even more. And I'm going to even do better research. So I don't sound so stupid.
No. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
No, you're great. And archaeologists are probably one of my favorite groups of people to talk with because it's so fun to talk about history. And we'll talk after this. But I want to say Assistant Professor Catherine Kearns, or Katie Kearns, as she likes to be called, Professor of Classics down there at the University of Chicago. How's that?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Anything you want to add before we go?
If this had happened 2 weeks ago, I would have said go Eagles, but unfortunately they lost the Super Bowl. So I'm just going to have to say, next year.
The Philly girl, the girl from Philly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Thank you.
All right. Well, wave goodbye, everybody. Thanks for coming, everybody. Bye. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.